Good afternoon and welcome to another MENA Spring Sessions 2022 Professional Development Workshop brought to you by the MENA PD Academy by Macmillan Education. And in this session, we are going to be looking at literacy development for primary school. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nathan Waller, and I am the teacher trainer for Macmillan Education here in the Middle East and North Africa region, or MENA region. And I cover everything from Morocco over to Oman in the East. And my job is to continue advancing learning in our markets of MENA. And here you can see our advancing learning themes across the bottom. We have 6 of them that we focus on. And today we are going to be looking at advancing teaching skills, the 5th one you can see. If you haven't seen me before, if you haven't joined me before, I also run the MENA PD Academy. If you're watching this on the YouTube page, you'll be with us at MENA PD Academy by Macmillan Education YouTube. But do connect with us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or you can go to our new website, menapdacademy.com, and find even more professional development activities there. Okay, so this session is actually the second part of a 2-part series looking at supporting literacy development through pre-primary and primary. So if you do go to the MENA PD Academy YouTube page, you can see the pre-primary session, which is already there, uploaded, and it was conducted by my colleague, Mohammed. And in this one, we looked at the building blocks of literacy development in the pre-primary classroom. What building blocks, what early exposure to literacy development do pre-primary students need, and how can we support them with that? And Mohammed did a really great workshop, lots of practical activities taken from Doodletown to help you start students on the path to success in terms of literacy. And now we're going to be moving on to primary stage and looking at how Global Stage, the Macmillan coursebook Global Stage, can support students even further as they go through primary with their literacy development. So Doodletown really giving them that solid base of literacy skills, and then Global Stage throughout primary really pushing that confidence, really enhancing those reading skills for our students. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. A quick refresher, literacy itself. And I've taken this very famous quote from Dr. Seuss. The more that you read, the more things that you will know. The more you learn, the more places you will go. And reading really is a stepping stone to a brighter future for our students. If you want to do pretty much anything in this world, if you want to succeed in any field, you're going to need to learn how to read and write competently. And we want to help our students, give them that foundation, give them those skills, and then hopefully they will succeed in later life. Now, the approach to literacy development traditionally has been often teacher-led, quite top-down, quite rigorous and focused on developing those core skills, kind of drilling phonics, getting students to kind of copy out passages. And Global Stage wants us to move away from that a little bit. It wants to make the process more student-centered, more inquiry-based, more critical, thinking about texts deeper, and challenging students to go as far as they can in terms of engaging with text and literacy. And we're going to see a little bit more about that as we go through this presentation. But we really want to be moving away from this teacher-led approach to literacy. I mean, for a start, it really, it's hard for teachers to balance out classroom management. Obviously, students who are 4, 5, 6, 7 years old, they don't want to be sitting at a desk, copying out passages, writing long paragraphs. So we need to find ways to get them to engage in their own ways. And we'll look at some of those examples in a bit. So yes, we are focusing on building and improving reading and writing skills. We do know, obviously, we have to cover certain things like the alphabet. We have to look at script, the direction of text, understanding how graphemes translate into phonemes, spelling, punctuation, these types of core aspects to literacy development. We cannot skip them, we cannot evade them. We do need to cover them, but we'll look at ways of covering them in more student-focused ways. And we need to recognize that literacy is a social and cultural practice. We learn to read and write to make meaning of the world around us, to expand our knowledge, expand how we interact with the world around us. And to do that, we need to be exposed to different types of text, different genres, different registers. And we need to learn how to analyze text critically, not just take everything we read at face value. Now, this has been taken from the teacher's book, so I don't need to explain too much about it. Again, I would recommend going back and watching that pre-primary webinar as well on the YouTube page, because Mohammed really nicely gives lots of examples for these 6 areas of early literacy: how to develop fine motor skills, auditory and visual discrimination, letter sound correspondence, word blending, these types of things. He gives lots of really good examples of getting students engaging with those activities. Now, one of the things that we did here at Macmillan is we designed Doodletown pre-primary and Global Stage primary hand in hand. They're designed to be a seamless transition from pre-primary to the primary classroom. One of the things we don't want to do is when students move from pre-primary to primary is to keep repeating things that they've already done. Oh, did they miss this? Did the teachers before cover this? Maybe they didn't, I'll do it again. We want students to be achieving as high as possible. These are high-level achievement courses. And in order to do that, we need to be pushing students as much as possible. So we've designed them both to have this 3-step reading approach. Now, in pre-primary, that's about listening to and enjoying texts, both fiction and non-fiction, and doing those early skills, prediction types of activities, value songs, looking at pictures, identifying things, and then starting to act stories out, personalizing the stories a little bit. That's pre-primary, and we're going to be looking at the 3-step reading approach in Global Stage throughout this presentation. So as you're reading that there, we will cover that again in a moment. So how do young learners learn to read and write? Now, of course, there are the more common reading and writing skills that we tend to see in primary course books, things like skimming for gist, scanning for information, identifying cause and effect, facts and opinions. These types of things, we see them quite commonly. And in writing skills, again, we see things like sentence building, we teach punctuation, text features. I'll give you a moment. Let me give you 30 seconds, because this list is not a fully comprehensive list. You can add things to this if you wish. So take a couple of seconds. I'll take a break and think, are there any other skills that you would add to this list? Okay, good. Moving on. So reading, let's look at reading first. And now in reading, we have these 2 different areas. We've got word recognition, so the ability to understand or have that awareness of phonological and phonemic aspects. We need students to obviously be able to decode the words, the written print, the symbolic print that they're reading. But we want them to build what's called automaticity. So we want them to be able to see common words and read them fluently. And we also need to expose them to irregular words as well, because we cannot just read phonologically. We cannot just see words on a page. It's too slow. detracts us away from the story itself. So we've got this kind of scientific aspect, this word recognition, and then we've got this oral language comprehension as well. So what vocabulary do we already know? What do we know about the story itself? What background knowledge can we bring in? And this is things like activating schemata. We'll see that in a second. And then we've got, obviously, sentence comprehension. And then we need to understand other types of language as well. So translating that communicative aspect of language into the literacy process, understanding things like metaphors, for example. This is reading. What about writing? So there are 4 key components to being able to write something. It's a very difficult skill, especially for English language learners if it's not their first language. So we need to understand the mechanics of writing. We need to understand, spelling, these types of things. We need to understand how to organize our writings, how to put things into paragraphs, how to start with a beginning, a middle, and an end. We, of course, need a language to be able to write something in the first place. And we need to have ideas. We cannot just write. We need to know, we need to think a little bit about what it is we want to write. And again, that brings this idea of meaning into the process. It needs to mean something to us when we write something down. This is why students don't enjoy copying very much. So there's these 4 key aspects or components to producing written pieces. We need to keep each of them in mind. We'll come back to this later when we look at some examples. Now, of course, we can't just think of every student as the same. We need to scaffold this learning process. One of the things about literacy is we're not born with the innate ability to learn to read and write. We have to be taught this. It's not like learning the communicative part of a language, where we learn that when we're babies, toddlers. These things need to be explicitly taught to us. We don't have the innate ability to learn to write. So we need to scaffold our students in this process. I've chosen one, but there are many that you could use in terms of scaffolding. I chose the I, we, you process. So the teacher modeling at the very beginning, demonstrating how to do tasks, but the teacher also thinking out loud, thinking through the process out loud, showing the students very clearly how I'm going through that process, and you'll be expected to do the same. And then we don't want to just pin down individual students, so we do things as a whole class, so students are supported within a network of their fellow peers. Everybody's doing it together. And then after that, we can set tasks asking students to do things independently by themselves. But at least they've seen us do it, they've seen the group do it, they've had lots of support, they've had lots of modeling, and they can then do that themselves, hopefully. Here's a sequence, an example. So reading or modeling the words, and students listen. So lots of listening, comprehension for students, being exposed to the language that they need to use. Reading the words in the picture, and then the students reading it out after us. So them kind of listening to what we're doing and then replicating that. And then we can differentiate, have stronger students doing things independently, weaker students perhaps being further modeled by the stronger students. Or you could flip that around as well, and you could ask the weaker students to do something, and then ask the stronger students to support them with error corrections, these types of things. So it's not coming from the teacher, having students support each other. Now, when I put in the I, we, and you, don't necessarily think about the I as being just have to be you modeling. This is where I would bring something like puppets in. They're a really nice way of being able to model language to students in a very student-friendly manner. So instead of me telling the students, I'm telling the puppet, and the students see my interactions with the puppet. The puppet might ask questions, these types of things, or I could ask the puppet questions, and the puppet could answer, and the puppet then acts as a model rather than the teacher. But it's clear at this point that we do need to differentiate what it is we're doing, because different students will be at different stages of their learning. They will have different abilities. You'll have mixed ability classes, I'm sure, but students will also have different interests. And depending on where you teach, the cultural backgrounds of your students could also be different. They're bringing different ideas, they're bringing different cultural and social ideas to the classroom that we should see as a positive thing, that we can bring in to conversations, to show and tells, all of these types of things. And when we look at examples in a minute, we can see how we might benefit from that. For us as a teacher, we can differentiate the content itself. We can pitch it at different levels. We could make the product of an activity at different levels, or we can differentiate the process itself. These are the three areas of differentiation. And again, we've got another session looking at differentiation in global stage that you can watch as well. Here's an example of something in global stage for differentiation. This is for product. So when it comes to writing, if they need more support, they've got these boxes so they can just write out what it is they need to do, put key vocabulary in different boxes. Or if you've got students who are much, I don't want to say weaker, but they need a little bit more challenge, then, sorry, if they're a little bit stronger and they need a bit more challenge, then they get to write out in more detail the language that we want them to be using. And again, there's other things that we could use. That's an example that's actually in global stage, but we can bring our own in. For example, this is a story map. So for weaker students, they might just be expected to draw very simple beginning, middle, and an end of the story map. If they are stronger students, we might get them to label the pictures that they've drawn. If they are weaker, they might just verbalize using the key vocabulary what it is that's in their pictures. If they're stronger, we might want them to explain in more detail using longer sentences, for example, their story parts. Okay, so let's look in more depth at using the global stage literacy book. Now, when it comes to global stage, we've already talked about this approach to teaching literacy. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to have this singular view of literacy. Yes, we want to be focusing on those key skills and improving them, understanding alphabets, scripts, directionality. We've mentioned these already, spelling, punctuation. But we want to move away from this idea that communication informs students' ability to read and write, that they need to learn how to listen and speak first, and then they will learn how to read and write, and seeing actually that it's all integrated, that reading and writing skills also lead to better communication skills. If students are engaging on a deeper level with the text, with the stories that they're engaging with. So if they're, if there's embedded critical thinking skills, if they're expected to change the endings of stories, that helps them to broaden their communication skills as well, and take those skills and use them in their speaking and communicative abilities as well. And then obviously there's this social and cultural practice that we mentioned as well. So students need to have some background knowledge. So taking the opportunity to set homework where they have to research that topic in their own country, for example, and then bringing that to class to have conversations about. We're going to be looking at the home. And of course, the homes that we see might not be the same as the homes of our students. So they can bring things from home, pictures, and they can start to use the vocabulary that we want them to be using, that we're working on, to talk about, to have discussions about the differences between the homes that they see in the pictures and the homes that they live in themselves. And what we want is literacy to be an inclusive practice. We want all children, all students to see themselves as both consumers and producers and analysts of texts. And so we have this idea of multi-literacies. Okay, that's quite a lot. So we're going to break it down and make it nice and simple. We want you to basically to remember this three-stage reading approach. I don't want us to get confused between a three-stage reading approach and a three-stage reading process. The process would be pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading. We've probably all used this already. This actually kind of overlaps with that, but this three-stage reading approach is engaging with texts. And for this, we want students to be enjoying the text. We want them to be doing things like prediction work. But it's largely about listening, about enjoying, about building that love of reading. And then number two, we want them to be exploring the text. We want them to analyze texts, not just read and enjoy and then move on. We want them to be able to deepen their understanding, use those critical thinking skills and develop those critical thinking skills to analyze what it is that they're reading, to be able to really think about it, to be able to talk about it, to have opinions about it, these types of things. And lastly, we want them to interact with the texts. We want them to either act out or perform, bringing in, again, that communicative aspect, and think more deeply about the content. But this interaction, it goes beyond comprehension. It's about fluency. And we'll look at examples of that. But just remember this three-stage: engage, explore, interact. Before we move into that, of course, Global Stage supports literacy development holistically. So we're exposing them to both fiction and non-fiction genres. And there's these very rich pieces of text or stories that we will see throughout. And this is what we want them to be exposed to. Because we need to appreciate that as students go through primary, as they're maturing, as they're developing, they're going to have a preference for certain types of text. If they enjoy music, they may grow to have a preference for poems. Some students are going to be really into science fiction. Some children will really enjoy biographies and learning about other people and their life journeys, for example. And so we need to be exposing them to a range so that they can make up their own minds what types of literature they have a preference for. And again, that feeds into that love of reading, that development of a love of reading. We've talked about some of the skills. We've talked about some of the key components for literacy development. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's one. Can you see which area of literacy development this develops? Let me give you a second to do that. Of course, this is looking at prediction. So we can see there, what do you think the reading is about? And they have to choose. So this is about predicting. And again, we can see the critical thinking activity on the left. And here is the story that would come afterwards. And we can see the very kind of child-friendly, very kind of rich pieces of literature, almost like a reading program embedded into the course itself. And there's loads of opportunities to expand literature, expand students' questioning, expand their critical thinking, to expand their vocabulary by engaging with these pictures. We don't necessarily need the text at the beginning. We can just get them to be exploring the pictures. What can they see? What is it like? What questions do they have? What are people doing? Yeah, all of these types of things. Is another activity that comes from Global Stage. And you can probably see from this one that it's about facts and opinions. We mentioned that before. And this is a key one. So when it comes to writing development, we want students to be developing this academic writing. So process writing is an important aspect within Global Stage. And when we look at secondary school, teens, young adult courses, certainly academic English courses, they all have this very structured very scaffolded approach to writing. And so we've embedded that into Global Stage as well, step-by-step writing development, not just sit down and write 100 words about the story that we've just been reading. Here's a question for you, you need to answer it. Taking them very slowly, step by step, and supporting them all the way through. And then if they are stronger, asking them to do additional work to push that even further. So let's look at the literacy book itself, because as you know, Global Stage has both a language book and a literacy book. And if you have watched our other video on the dual approach, my colleague Ola, she looked at how to use the language book and the literacy book in complement to each other. But we're going to be looking more in depth in this video at the literacy book. So we start off the unit with this very kind of bold, colorful, engaging picture. We've got our visual thinking routine, not just what can you see, but what do you think about what you can see? What does this picture make you wonder? And there's loads going on in this picture for them to be able to think about. Why is there an octopus in the garden? What is coming out of the chimney? What can you see in each of the rooms? It's not like a traditional course book, which would just have a picture of a house, you know, with elements labeled: bedroom, bed, house, roof, garden. This is what we would normally see, and we would pre-teach that vocabulary. We don't have time for that. We want to be pushing our students even further than that. So we're getting them engaged with the picture, not just can you remember the words or what looks familiar. And that's all carefully scaffolded. We then have our first piece of text, which is this one, fiction, to start with. So we have here a really rich piece of literature, and we've got our words in context. So I mentioned just then that we're not pre-teaching the vocabulary. We're using such a rich text that the vocabulary is presented in a way where students need to identify it using context clues. Yes, we've got the words there, and we're going to be relating back to those words. But what we want is for them to be engaging with those words within the context of the text itself. So not teaching new words, not using the words in a sentence, not explaining them, not giving definitions, not translating them from their first language, but getting students to think about the pictures that they're seeing, getting them to think about the words that they can see on the page, and using those context clues. And this builds and supports fluency. If we try to teach every single word out of context, we would run out of time quite clearly. So we need to be teaching them words in context, a very inductive approach. And you've got audio support as well in Navio to help you with this. We've then got the rest of the text itself. And again, lots of that social and cultural aspect that we were mentioning before brought into all of this. So as you go through Global Stage, you will see loads of different types of social and cultural contexts, which again gives us lots to talk to our students about. Is this the same as your life? Is this the same as where you live? What kinds of things can we see? We can see them drinking something. Do you guys drink like that? Do you play this type of game? And then we've got these little teaching assistant tips as well, these little questions. So this one is about counting sheep. So again, we can ask, in your culture, what do you guys do to fall asleep? After we've engaged with this very rich text, we've got our very kind of classic comprehension, text analysis, we've got some phonics work, we've got that embedded social and emotional learning and CLIL aspect as well. But try to move away from doing this as individualized activities. It's very tempting to just get the students to do this. Okay, we've been doing the reading. Okay, now sit down for 10 minutes and fill in the answers, and then we'll go through them one by one as a class. Try to make the activities as interactive as possible. Maybe you could set them as a survey. Maybe you can do them as pair work. Maybe students can walk around the room and interview other students with the questions. So certain students have certain questions, they don't have to have them all, and they go around and they ask. And again, you can then be monitoring and listening to make sure that they're using that language, and then you can reinforce any errors or anything that you think needs reinforcement. Things like the phonics at the bottom. So if they're going around and they're asking one of the questions and you're listening, okay, are they really emphasizing those phonic sounds? And then you can have you can use your classroom management. So you hear something and then you pause the students. Okay, everybody pause. Okay, we need to focus on this sound, the sl sound, or st, st. So maybe one of the students has been doing question one. So he or she goes to another student and says, why does the girl want to run away? And they say, storm is near. Okay, and you heard the emphasis on st. Okay, I need to do a bit of work there. So you can pause the class and focus on that phonic, rather than, again, just pre-teaching that phonics one by one. It's more meaningful, more interactive with the students. We've already mentioned CLIL, and there's loads of opportunities to bring various aspects of CLIL into our content through the medium of these stories. Again, we were looking at the home, so we could be talking about architecture, for example. And if we look at the language book, there's loads of different examples of architecture in there. And again, then we could be looking at all sorts of things: shapes, colors, sizes, measurements, all of these other types of things that we can bring into the language classroom, and perhaps reinforce some of the topics that they've already been doing in pre-primary or in year one, for example. Okay, then we've got the next section, which is phonics, spelling, and literacy, literary terms. And again, as I was just mentioning there, we don't want to get stuck just in tier one. We want to make sure that our students are moving through towards this fluency approach to literacy. It's very easy to just keep doing phonics over and over again, but we need to be moving towards spelling, literary terms, and reading speed. We need to get them reading quicker and quicker and engaging with more and more texts. So there's plenty of support there for students, but make sure as a teacher, we're moving them through this process. And Global Stage quite nicely helps to scaffold that process as well. We then have a non-fiction, and again, even more scaffolded practice. We've got more scaffolded practice, and then we're taking a little bit of it away, but we're still scaffolding, but a little bit less. So we've got different types of activities, different types of scaffolded activities. And again, we're activating that schema with questions, thinking about what it is that we might be seeing, predicting what we're going to be seeing. We've then got the text. Again, we can see our words in contexts. We go through the readings themselves, looking at different types of homes. Again, the last page. So they're all different, but they're always home. And Global Stage is neither, I would say, British or American. It gives us both examples. So students can learn the differences between American and British vocabularies. We also have a video. So if you want to use a flipped classroom approach, you want students to preview the material at home so that we can do more interactive work in class. Or if you just want them to have an opportunity or reinforcement after we've done the lesson, so you can go home and if you didn't really understand something, or you want to practice some of the things that we've been doing in class today, you can go to the Navio and you can look at the videos in your own time, giving students who perhaps need a little bit more exposure, a little bit more time to absorb the language. We're giving them that opportunity. And again, as we come towards the end, we've got comprehension, and again, try to make that interactive if possible. And we finish each time, each literacy unit with this kind of key question that kind of brings together the two texts and the theme of the unit. So this one was all about homes. So again, this is coming into the kind of the assessment. And again, we've got this self-assessment at the end. but getting students to be able to articulate what it is that they've learned, to show what it is that they've learned, so that we can monitor, record, and make sure that they are moving forward appropriately. I don't need to read all of this out, but just to reinforce what we've been seeing there, this approach to language and literacy being student-centered, inquiry-based, getting students to ask questions, and getting students to think deeper about the text. So we've got all of the skills, and you can see where they are within the unit, and we've got this idea of this social and cultural practice. And again, you can see where that is explicitly put into the unit itself. Okay, so that is our approach to global stage from our side. But of course, when we're in the classroom, we want to extend that. We want our students to be succeeding. We want their outcomes to be as high as possible. So I thought to kind of bring the session towards an end, we would look at extending literacy learning, taking that content, taking the course book, and thinking about, well, how does that translate into practice in the classroom? So for most people, a unit of global stage would probably take 2 weeks, I would say. Maybe if you have a bit more time, you can extend it. You may have a little less time, which means you have to be very selective. What is it I'm going to leave out? What activities can I get students to do by themselves? If you've got about, but I'm working on, if you have around 2 weeks to be able to cover a unit of global stage. So let's have a look at what that 2 weeks might look like if I was planning out a unit of global stage. What would I do to extend and push my students to the maximum? So of course, I want to introduce them to the language element. So I'm not going to focus too much on the language book itself, but of course, if we're using the sandwich approach that Ola mentioned before, we would start with the language book. Yes, I would do vocabulary. I would probably flip the classroom, get students to interact with the key vocabulary ahead of time, communicate with parents to make sure that they work with the student ahead of time to learn the key vocabulary, so that we could be doing the Explore Language section. We could do some interactive activities around the global citizenship theme. This one, for example, is technology in schools. So we can have conversations around what technology we have in our school. Does our school look like other schools? And again, we could do some of these activities interactively. And some of them students could be doing by themselves, but they've been introduced in these first few days to the core vocabulary, the core grammar, and the theme of the unit itself. What I want them to do, though, on day 3, and as you can see, day 1, 2, and 3 was the language book, but I want to start dropping in the elements of the literacy book. So on day 3, a part of the lesson would be to think about this picture, which is the first page of the literacy book. And let's do together the critical thinking exercise. So we would just flip to the literacy book at some point on day 3. We would also be doing parts of the language book still, that's fine. But I want them to be engaging with the critical thinking of this page in that lesson. And again, on day 2, I could have set them a homework to go home and look at this picture by themselves. So homework from day 2 is have a look at the first 2 pages of the literacy book and come back tomorrow prepared to say what it is that you can see in that picture. And again, if we could communicate with parents, they could do this ahead of time. And then each student, when they're articulating in class, would have different things to say, because their parents would have had different ways of engaging with this picture. But that's day 3, or the first day of the literacy book. On day 4, again, I'm going to still be doing my language book work, because there's a lot of content in that language book to cover. But at some point, perhaps towards the end of the lesson on day 4, I'm going to set them a teaser activity. I'm not going to just dive straight into the literacy book. I'm just going to show them this picture, which again, you can find very easily on Navio. And the teaser activity is just to introduce Clara. So we've come towards the end of the lesson on day 4. We finished our activities from the language book. We've got 10 minutes left. We sit together as a group, and I bring up this picture, and I say, this is Clara. And tomorrow on day 5, we're going to be doing all about the things that Clara invents. And again, I could set them homework then for that day. Maybe they could find something that's invented in their country, or they could perhaps invent something themselves, or they could find an invention in their home and take a picture of it to bring to class. But basically, I want them to just be thinking initially about who Clara is, and they've just been introduced to her, ready for the next day. And I put some ideas on the side, choosing your favorite invention. Maybe you could draw something at home and then present it tomorrow. And again, that's very child friendly. They're thinking, okay, that's very open. I can go and I can figure something out. Maybe a sibling will help me, maybe my parent will help me, and I can bring something tomorrow to present to the class. That's just day 4. 10 minutes, probably no more than that, introducing what's going to be coming up. And again, if we think about it from a psychological point of view, think about when you go to watch a movie at the cinema, you tend to see an advert of that movie before you go. And there's a purpose behind those adverts. They're basically to entice you in, to give you a feel of what's coming and get you excited about it. If we just come in and we say, okay, today is day 5, open your books, now we're going to do a story, no setup, no thinking, I'm going to read the story to you, it's less engaging for our students. Okay, and then on day 5, I'm just going to be focusing on the enjoyment. So I'm not thinking about the words, I'm not focusing too much on vocabulary or what grammatical structures are used within the story. We're just thinking about the story as something that can be enjoyed. Again, you've got Navio there to help you, you've got Tap and Teach, but really we're just using simple questions just to keep their engagement going. Yeah. So that day is all about enjoying the story, day 5. Then they've got the weekend. Again, they can read the story by themselves or with their parents. They can do the Navio activities around that story. But at the moment, we're just getting them to enjoy. And again, we've got those steps, those 3 stages that we mentioned before. Enjoyment being the first. Okay, now we've come back after the weekend. We've got day 6. Now we want them to start exploring. So we've teased them, we've introduced, we've got them to engage with the story on an enjoyment level. I'm still going to read it to them aloud. I still want them to have the listening exposure to the story. But I could ask slightly more challenging questions. For example, in the picture, I've removed a word. Can they come up with what that word is? And we could ask other questions about, what can you see in the picture? How many things can you see? What colors can you see? What do you think that she's drawing? Because that's a slightly different type of question to, can you see scissors? Yes or no? Or more challenging than that, how many pieces of stationery can you see? And then they have to count them. But a more challenging question is, what do you think that she's drawing right now? She's drawing a new invention. What do you think it might be? This is a more challenging, critical thinking type of question. Here we're getting them to engage more with the text itself, but still engaging with the story in an enjoyable way, but at a deeper level. Day 7, still reading them to them aloud, and I could be using the Navio video format if I wanted to, but now we're starting to explore those post-reading activities. And there's an example here, think and discuss. But we want them to be doing something, we want them to be extending the reading that they're doing. They've interacted with it a lot, they've explored it a lot now. So now we want them to take what they know and expand upon that. And in day 8, we want them to really extend. So we've had these 3, we've seen the enjoyment, we've seen the explore, and we've seen the interact. But actually, I want them to do more than that. So I want to extend it. And this is where I think project-based learning really can kind of come into its own. So yes, we've done post-reading activities, we've done comprehension, We've done follow-ups. They may have rewritten the ending. They may have told the story from a different point of view. For example, in that last picture, how do you think the mum feels about her making these inventions? Not just looking at it from the protagonist's type of point of view, thinking about the text in different ways with students, helping them to expand their thinking. But really, extending it goes beyond that. So we could have a project around the theme of inventions. We could bring in other types of reading, extended reading. We could look at videos on YouTube about children inventing things, or arts fairs, science fairs. They could do group work. They could design something by themselves if they like to work alone. But again, bringing that CLIL aspect in, connecting to other areas of learning. And then we still have day 9, and we still have day 10, where we're going to be focusing on those presentation skills from the language book, the write about it sections, and the self-assessment. But bringing in that project element can attach to each of those things. So the presentation could be done in tandem with the language book. We can start to bring them in and make sure that they complement each other. And again, we can make it really fun. If let's say they was designing in pairs an invention, they could present them, and then students could vote for their favorite. And again, awards then don't just come from the teacher. It's not yours was my favorite invention. Students can self-assess, they can peer assess, and they can have fun awards based on that. And you can make that nice and fun for them, I'm sure. And again, I come up with some ideas for other post-reading activities. Yes, it could be a project, but it doesn't have to be. They could do a play or a pantomime around a part of the story, and then have others guess which parts that they're doing. They could write a letter to the main character in the story. I mentioned about the mom before, but it could be that Clara sends one of her inventions to Apple, and then you could be somebody from Apple who responds to that letter. This could be for very strong students. If it's slightly weaker students, they might want to do a finger puppet show or a puppet show of the plot. So they're basically just recreating, but giving them an opportunity to use the language in a meaningful way. Or I've already mentioned the other one, rewriting endings, changing the story from the point of view of a different character. These are really nice. Think about things like the hare and the tortoise. Could you tell the story a different way if it's told from the perspective of the hare, for example? Or if you're looking at the picture books, there's people who are watching. I know that there's like fox and badger who are watching. How do they feel about what's going on? All of these types of things really extend the literacy development for our students. Okay, that brings us to the end, and I'd like you to take a few moments just to reflect on the different ideas we've looked at in today's sessions. Which ones do you like and why? What recommendations would you have yourself? Of course, these are just some ideas, and I'm sure you have lots of ideas that you would be able to share based on your experiences in the primary and pre-primary classroom as well. But do you see these as being useful, the things that we've mentioned today? Can you use any of these techniques, these activities, these ideas with your learners? And what benefits could that bring to your learners? What challenges might that bring as well? Think about the challenges that could come up by changes within the primary classroom, because that's an important part of reflection as well. Just to recap, some of the important points that I brought up today: definitely scaffold literacy development. It's not something that's innate to us. It needs to be explicit, but it needs to be scaffolded for young learners. Differentiate, because you will have different types of learners and different types of abilities in your classroom. Set yourself up for success. Good planning leads to good outcomes. Don't rush. Literacy development takes time. Students need to do things multiple times. You cannot just expect them to read something once and remember it. They might remember it, but will they really be able to engage with it at that deeper level? Probably not. So don't rush. Give them time to process, especially those students that need a little bit more support. Use things like Navio, use the flipped classroom approach to give them more exposure to what it is that we want them to be doing. Extend as much as possible with things like project work, and get parents involved. Student success is largely built on our ability to get parents involved in that learning process. And when it comes to literacy, students need exposure to as much reading as possible, and parents really play a key part of that. The more books they have at home, the more English language books they have, and a range of books that they have at home, the better that they will do in class. Not just with reading and writing, but with all the other aspects of learning, all the subjects that they learn, all come down to that literacy component. Be careful. I've not put do's and don'ts, I've just put be careful, be aware of. Try not to make them read out loud unseen content. It's very tempting to say, open to page 4, okay, Mohammed, I want you to read out the first paragraph. Try to restrict yourself from doing this. Don't get them to read it out loud. Reading out loud should be purposeful, it should be planned, and it needs to have meaning to the student. So it could be reading out their own work, their own written work, if they're presenting. It could be just to comprehension check, but try not to get them to read out unseen content. I already mentioned throughout the presentation, try not to get stuck in that phonics section. It's very easy to keep doing phonics over and over and over again. Phonics is just one aspect on the path to literacy learning. So try to move them on, move to the spelling, move to the comprehension, move to the critical thinking, and don't get stuck in the phonics zone. And I would also say be careful, try not to lose time pre-teaching vocabulary. One of the nice things about Global Stage is that words in context feature. Get them to engage with the pictures, the text, and don't pre-teach them the vocabulary. Get them to self-teach themselves, learn strategies, how to learn vocabulary by themselves. And they can then take those strategies and use them in other ways. And that brings us to the end of this presentation. I'd like to thank you very much. My email is there, but do connect with us, as I said, at the MENA PD Academy. If you're watching this on the YouTube page, please do subscribe down below so you can keep up to date with all of the other professional development activities that we have. Do go to the website, menapdacademy.com, and see what other professional development activities we have there. But for now, I'd like to wish you and your students all the very best with their literacy development, and we hope you continue to enjoy using Global Stage and Doodletown with your students. And we see you again in the future. Take care for now, everybody. Bye-bye.